Hello everybody, so this is the third lesson in Conflict and Tension, Hitler's Foreign Policy and the Steps to World War II. By this point you should already have done your note taking, your revision resources on the knowledge. We've got two previous PowerPoints that take you through that. Make sure you've done that first, please. So today we're going to have a look at the 12-mark question 2, which is a source question. We haven't looked at this since we looked at the Treaty of Versailles, because we didn't look at this style of question when we did the League of Nations. So this is one where you look at the two sources and you're looking at how useful they are to a historian studying a particular thing, a particular event or issue. So you have to look at the sources, you have to think about the provenance, the background of them, and you have to use the knowledge as well. So as it says at the bottom here, the question is driven by the source, so actual content, what can you see, what does it tell you, the background of it, and your knowledge. So what general technique do we need to answer this question? Well, this question, of course, is all about how useful sources are to historians. Well, if it's how useful a source is, of course, you've got to think about what does it show or say, who produced it, and how does that make a difference to how useful it is? How does it fit in with what we already know? They're the three things that you must consider. So you start off with the content every single time. What does the source show? What can you learn from it? Just by looking at the source or by reading the source about that particular topic. And you're selecting 2 or 3 things from the source if possible. And then, of course, you're thinking about, well, it is or it isn't useful because it does or it doesn't match with your knowledge. And you give a piece of knowledge or two to help support what you're saying. Also, within that first paragraph, when you're looking at the first source, you then think about, well, what's the background? Who made it? When was it made? Why? And then how does that make it useful to a historian? We're going to have a look at an example of this in action in a moment. And then you simply repeat it for the second source. Finally, you answer the question. So you're deciding how useful 2 sources are in telling you about a certain thing. So you're looking at how useful both those sources are. You're not comparing them, you're not deciding which one's more useful. You're deciding as a pair how useful are they to a historian. Let's have a look at an example. Here's the example then that we're going to work through today. So what we've got is sources B and C, and the question is, how useful are sources B and C to a historian studying why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland? Explain your answers using B and C and your contextual, your background knowledge. So let's have a quick look at the sources. We've got source B, which is the front cover of a magazine, Illustrazioni del Popolo, from the 9th of October 1938, and we've got a speech from Hitler to the people of Berlin in 1938. So when we're answering this question, we're going to write 1 paragraph on source B, all about what's going on there and what it tells us about why Britain didn't get involved and didn't stop Hitler. And then we've got the speech here, which is going to be our second paragraph, and we're going to talk all about what this shows us, both the content, our own knowledge, and of course the provenance of the source. And then finally, we're going to write a conclusion that involves both of these sources. Let's have a look at source B first. Let's then start with the first source. Let's start with source B. Remember, what we're looking at is how useful this is to a historian trying to find out why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland, why we didn't stop it. So let's have a look at what we can see in this picture. So we've got the Illustrazioni del Popolo, so this is the Italian magazine, and it's showing lots of Nazi flags everywhere. They're coming out of all the buildings, the shops, the offices, all around, the people carrying them in the streets. People are waving and cheering. There's really, really strong support as this Nazi army, massive Nazi army, marches through the streets. There's excitement, children running and waving, really, really big crowds. I mean, the streets are really properly lined. What we know about the background of this is that 3 million people did live in the Sudetenland who would class themselves as being German. They were German-speaking people. Many of these people had been part of Germany prior to World War I and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So this is just after the Munich Agreement. It's actually, if we look at the date here, it's the 9th of October 1938. The Nazi army didn't actually march into the Sudetenland until the 10th of October. So this is an Italian look at what the takeover was going to look like? So part of this is that this is an Italian magazine, remember they're allies with Hitler. They know this is what it's going to look like. So they're kind of anticipating the welcome. So this isn't a real look at what happened. This is an Italian interpretation of how the people of the Sudetenland were going to respond. And they were going to respond according to Hitler's ally here, really excitedly. Now, this is probably true anyway, isn't it? Because we know that the people of Sudetenland, many of them would have been happy. Not all of the people in that area were German, not all of them would have supported Hitler. But this is a view that was going to be really popular. And therefore, if we think about how it relates to the question, well, it's pretty obvious really, isn't it? That the British didn't stop Hitler from taking over the Sudetenland because it was really popular with the people who lived there. Remember when we looked at Austria and the taking over of Austria? Well, 99.75% of the population eventually voted for that takeover. I know there was propaganda involved and some threats, but there is also a lack of resistance in the Sudetenland as well. So it seemed like a silly thing for Britain to go to war over. So our next source, actually source C rather than source B, this is a written source this time round. What is this saying? So Hitler in this speech is saying, we are not interested in breaking peace. I am thankful to Mr. Chamberlain for all his trouble, and I assured him that the German people want nothing but peace. But I also declared that I cannot go beyond the limits of our patience. I further assure him, and I repeat here, that if this problem is solved, there will be no further territorial problems in Europe for Germany. So, what's clear from this source? The Germans are making it clear they don't want war. They're not interested in breaking peace. They're pleased and thankful about what has happened. They're thankful to Mr. Chamberlain for all his trouble. Remember, he'd come and gone, hadn't he? He'd been to Germany 3 times in September of 1938 to try and solve what was known as the Sudeten crisis. It's a really reassuring tone. It's reassuring the German people there's not going to be war. It's reassuring anybody British that is listening that Chamberlain did the right thing. It shows they don't want anything else. They're satisfied. There'll be no further territorial problems in Europe for Germany. They're not going to demand any more land. It seems from this that appeasement was the right policy for Britain and that war had been avoided. This is a public speech, and obviously it fits in with what we know about what Hitler had promised in that piece of paper, that he said that he was now satisfied and he didn't want to take any more. Obviously, we know that the next year he does take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, but certainly when we're looking at this, it does look as if Britain handed over the Sudetenland because Hitler was reassuring. Hitler seemed reasonable. Remember, that was one of the key reasons for the policy of appeasement, that things that Hitler was asking for actually seemed kind of fair enough to the people of Britain. So there's our 2 sources. On the next slide, I'm going to show you how I tackled and how I answered this question. Okay, so let's have a look at how I've tackled and how I've answered this question. So first of all, I've talked about, I've addressed the question. Source B is useful to a historian studying why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland in many ways. In the source, I can see Nazi army parading through the streets of the Sudetenland being cheered by a crowd of supporters, all waving flags with a swastika on. I can also see that the buildings on the streets are all displaying the Nazi flag throughout the town. This suggests there was strong support for a Nazi takeover of the Sudetenland and from within. So all of that is my use of the source. I'm going to switch colours, and now I'm using my own knowledge. From my own knowledge, I know there was around 3 million German-speaking people living in the Sudetenland that had been displaced by the Treaty of Versailles. Then I'm referring to the question then, look. This is useful. So I'm going to change my colour again. This is useful as it helps the historian to understand that an impetus or a reason behind giving in to Hitler's demands was the fact that there was support for the takeover from within. Absolutely, I'm going back to my knowledge. Moreover, I know that over time, British public opinion of the Treaty of Versailles had developed, and many now felt that Hitler was taking over what was rightfully Germany's. So I'm now going to go on to the provenance. The source was produced in an Italian magazine soon after Hitler had made his demands, but actually the day before the troops marched in. This is useful as it shows that other European countries were also of the understanding that this is what the people in the Sudetenland wanted. There was no reason to stop Hitler, as this was going to be really popular. The people had no reason in the Sudetenland to stop Hitler. One potential pitfall is that following the Anti-Comintern Pact, remember that pact between Italy, Japan and Germany against communism, the Italian press would have had an agenda in maintaining the alliance. So this was about maintaining that friendship as well and glorifying the event. Okay, so all of that really, really useful. So let's have a look at our second source. So do you remember in that first source then, I've used the source. I have also given knowledge. I've made reference in several places. I didn't even highlight it here, look, did I at the start? I've done that at the very beginning. I've made real reference to the question. So I've done that in a couple of places. And I've also made reference to the provenance all the way through the source there. So source C is also useful to a historian studying why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland. In the source, so I'm now going back to using the source, he says, I further assure him that if the problem is solved, there will be no further territorial problems in Europe for Germany. This suggests that the acquisition of the Sudetenland is the last piece of the jigsaw in Hitler's territorial aims. This is useful to a historian as it helps the historian reference the question in understanding the psychology behind appeasement, why it was done. Then I'm going to my knowledge again. From my knowledge, I know that Chamberlain was keen to appease Hitler, give him a little of what he wanted in the hope of avoiding a full-scale war. So knowing about appeasement and British motivations is crucial here. I also know that during their discussions, Hitler was adamant that initially at least he would stop if he was allowed to take the Sudetenland. That's what all of those visits between him and Chamberlain were about. Now I'm going to go back to provenance. The source is from a speech given by Hitler himself in 1938. It's useful because the historian can see what Hitler was saying in the public eye, the message he was putting across to his own people. If this was a message he was putting across at home, it's easy to see why Chamberlain didn't feel a pressing need to be concerned by Hitler's actions, and therefore it makes it clear to see why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland. So again, a little bit of a reference to the question again at the end. So how have I concluded then? Because I've done a good job here, I think, if I do say so myself, of talking through the two sources. I've made plenty of references to the question. I have used the actual content of the sources. I've put in some knowledge and I've discussed provenance. So far, the examiner is going to be pretty impressed with what I'm writing. Let's have a look at the last bit. In conclusion, both sources are useful to the historian because they show different aspects of why Britain allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland. They show that Chamberlain was following a policy of appeasement on the grounds that he genuinely believed it would prevent a war. Moreover, they show that there was public support for the takeover around Europe and in the Sudetenland, which helps the historian see that Britain did not feel the need to stand in Germany's way. So in the conclusion, I've just reiterated the reasons why Britain allowed this to happen from looking at those two sources. So this is the kind of answer that you need to try and be producing, making sure you're following the formula. So making frequent references to the question, using the content of the source, using some knowledge to support and back that up, and also discussing the provenance of the source and making it clear how that makes it useful. So this is the one that I want you to tackle. So there's two sources here, just like the ones that I've just looked at and gone through with you, and I want you to have a go at this on your own. So this time the focus is on appeasement. So study sources A and B. How useful are these sources to a historian studying attitudes towards the policy of appeasement? So what do people think of appeasement? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your contextual knowledge. So we've got our first source, one that we're familiar with, the one where you've got the Nazi monsters and you've got the appeaser. The appeaser, it says, the one in the middle. He's got all these lollipops and he's saying, remember, one more lollipop and then you all go home. And then we've got one from a British newspaper just after the signing of the Munich Agreement on the 30th of September 1938 that is a really positive look about what Chamberlain has achieved. So have a look, and on the next slide I'm going to tell you how to actually do it, the kind of formula. It's exactly the same formula as we looked at earlier. Your first paragraph when answering this question about how useful are these sources to a historian studying attitudes towards the policy of appeasement, your first paragraph, you tell me about what you can see, what's going on, what does that tell you about what people thought about appeasement? Select some things that you can see, so think about the content, and then think about whether that matches with your knowledge of appeasement. Think about the background, the provenance, the who, the when, the why. Particularly in that first source, look at when it was written. It's from 1941. Think about what we already knew about appeasement by that point, about what had already broken out. And then you just repeat for that second written source. Feel free to wind this back, go back as many times as you want and have a look at my example answer and how I answered that. If you do that, you're going to be really successful in having a go yourself. And then a conclusion where you're actually deciding, well, how useful are those sources? This should take you around 15 minutes, certainly not more than that. Have a go. Pauses, look at the other sources as much as you can to get that information so you know what you're doing. Okay, so your job is really simple. Have a go at that exam question. This isn't a massively long YouTube clip this time. We've kept it down just one example, so you've got time now to have a go at the question and send it to your teacher. You've also, if you've got spare time at the end of the lesson, to make sure you're preparing for the short answer test.